Disney's D23 Expo happened a few days ago, and I've made a few videos talking about some of the things that were announced at the expo. This is very likely going to be the final video I make talking about the announcements, as I only felt like making videos on the announcements that interested me, the announcements that I thought would make for good videos. Stuff like Frozen 3 and Zootopia 2 I just don't really care about. Stuff like that new Pixar movie that was announced, Hoppers, I don't have anything interesting to say about them. On account of the fact that, specifically for Hopper's case, we know almost nothing about these movies, and so I can't really say much about them. What we're going to be talking about today could fit that criteria of being like, we know literally nothing about it, but I feel like there's more stuff for me to talk about with it when compared to these other movies, just because it's a movie that a lot of people had been looking forward to, a movie that a lot of people have been wanting to see. At Disney's D23 Expo this year, Pixar announced two new movies, Hoppers, an original movie, and Incredibles 3. Yep, that's right. Incredibles 3 is coming soon. The Incredibles is officially going to become a trilogy. I was originally going to talk about Hoppers in this video alongside Incredibles 3, but then I decided against it because, again, there wasn't really much for me to say about Hoppers. The brief premise that we have for the movie hasn't really, convinced me that the movie's going to be anything great. I mean, listen, I'm glad that Pixar's still going to make original movies despite Inside Out 2's success, but this movie hasn't really won me over just yet. Only time will tell, though. Only time will tell. Incredibles 3, in comparison, we know nothing about it either, but I feel like there's a lot more stuff for me to say about it, just because it is the third movie of one of Pixar's most beloved movies. When you take into consideration the context that, The Incredibles is a widely beloved movie, Incredibles 2 is a lot more polarizing and divided. There are a lot of people that like the movie, but there are people that don't think it's good. Generally, though, a lot of people think that the movie is inferior to the first Incredibles, myself included. I think it's a decent movie, but it is nowhere near as good as the first Incredibles, and that's disappointing to me. That allows for this to be a more interesting movie to talk about. As such, this video is just gonna briefly go over what I hope to see out of this movie, and what to expect from it. We don't even know what the movie's gonna be about. We don't know when the movie's gonna come out, although I think it's likely it's gonna come out in 2027. Next year in 2025, we're getting Elio. In 2026, we're getting both Toy Story 5 and Hoppers, so it only makes sense that Incredibles 3 would be in 2027. Let's hope that the 9-year wait between Incredibles 2 and Incredibles 3 won't be as painful as the nearly 15-year-long wait between Incredibles 1 and Incredibles 2. Now, I know a lot of you are excited for this movie, and I'm excited for it as well, don't get me wrong, but I feel it's important to remember to manage your expectations for this movie. Everyone was excited for Incredibles 2 when it was first announced. Incredibles 2 was probably top 5 most highly anticipated sequels of all time. The GTA 6 of animated movies, I'd say. And, well, look how it turned out. It's not a terrible movie, but it has a lot of flaws in it, and it is nowhere near as good as the first movie. A lot of what made the first movie so good wasn't present in Incredibles 2, and the chances of Incredibles 3 being disappointing and underwhelming like Incredibles 2, well, they're not impossible. They're not unlikely. Best case scenario, this ends up being a Cars situation, where the first movie is great, and then the second movie is not good, and then the third movie is much better than the second movie, and it feels like a true sequel to the first movie. Obviously, Cars 1 is nowhere near as good as Incredibles 1, and Incredibles 2 is nowhere near as bad as Cars 2, but still. Considering the fact that the plot for Incredibles 2 was just almost essentially the same as the plot for Incredibles Incredibles 1, I hope that this movie will have an original storyline instead, which I find to be much more likely. So at least that's one thing this movie will have over Incredibles 2. I made a video a while back talking about Incredibles 2 and what makes it so disappointing, and something that I pointed out is the whole thing that, like, the Incredibles are meant to be a superhero family, and yet very rarely in these movies do they ever actually, like, fight together as a family. Only at, like, the ending of the first Incredibles do they fight together as a family. And then in Incredibles 2, it's only at the very beginning and the very end. I give the first movie a pass for this because it could act as like a sort of origin story for the characters. But for Incredibles 2, there is no excuse at all. And I think that's one of the many reasons why Incredibles 2 fails as a sequel. So hopefully in Incredibles 3 we get to see more of the family, like, actually fighting together as a family. The whole thing of, like, you know, the Incredibles is a family of superheroes. We actually get to see that utilized in this third movie. The second movie was just essentially an Elastigirl solo movie, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but, like, you cannot market the movie as being like, look, the family's all together again, and then it's like only in, like, the very beginning and end of the movie do they fight together as a family. That's just false advertising, I'm sorry. I also hope that Incredibles 3 has a much better villain in it than Incredibles 2. I mainly just want there to be a villain that's, like, established to be evil from the very beginning. There is no way in hell they could pull off the twist villain stuff as well as they did with Syndrome in the first movie. That's just impossible. It would be much easier for them to make a purely evil villain from the start, rather than a villain that's like, oh, he's a good guy at first and then he turns out he's evil. Last thing any of us want is for Roxanne over here to be repeated again a second time. Those are just a few of the things that I hope for with Incredibles 3. Most of it is just don't be like Incredibles 2. That's basically what it is. Again, we know nothing about the movie. We don't have a synopsis for what the movie's gonna be about. All we know is we're getting Incredibles 3 and we're likely getting it in 2027. A lot of the stuff that I hope to see in this movie just largely boils down to I hope it's not Incredibles 2. Don't be like Incredibles 2. Even if that ends up being the case though, there's still a very real chance that the movie will be nowhere near as good as the first Incredibles. The chances of Incredibles 3 being better than Incredibles 2 are significantly more likely than the chances of Incredibles 3 being anywhere near as good as Incredibles 1. Right off the bat, I'm just going to assume that the darker tone that the first movie had is not going to be in this third movie. It wasn't in Incredibles 2, I don't see why they're gonna put it into Incredibles 3. At some point I want to make a video going over the first Incredibles and what makes it such a good movie, and why it disappoints me that we'll never get another Pixar movie, no, another animated movie like it ever again. Just a one and done masterpiece, and that's it. In a way, I kinda don't want this movie to happen because I don't want to run the risk of it being like, oh, it's good, but it's not like anywhere near as good as the first movie, like Incredibles 2 was. I don't want to have a trilogy where it's like the first one is the only great movie and then like the sequels just pale in comparison. The Incredibles feels like a movie franchise that would have like this perfect trilogy where every movie is a 10 out of 10, and yet more likely than not it's going to be a trilogy where the first movie is a 10 out of 10, but then the sequels are like more 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10. And that's just disappointing to me. Then again, this has happened before with certain movie franchises, where they're famous franchises, but only like 1 or 2 movies are actually great. The Matrix has 4 movies, but only the first one is considered a classic. Jurassic Park has 6 movies, but only the first one is considered a classic. Terminator has 6 movies, but only the first 2 are considered classics. That sort of thing. So if Incredibles ends up being like this, where it's like the first one is the only great one of the trilogy, then, well, it sucks of course, but it's happened before. Here's hoping that doesn't happen though. Here's hoping this movie ends up being great. It ends up feeling like a worthy sequel to The Incredibles. Remember though, please remain cautious with your optimism, okay? If you go go into this movie with lowered expectations, it won't feel as disappointing. The disappointment won't be as strong. Please remember that in the future. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.